Okay, guys, so welcome to episode 3 of 905 Kung Fu. I'm here with Sifu Moseley, and I'm Sifu Atalick from Niagara Kung Fu. Sifu Moseley is from Big Dipper Boxing, and we're here to catch up on what's going on in Kung Fu land all around the Golden Horseshoe. And we were throwing back some ideas on what we were going to talk about tonight, and I'm not sure who came up with the idea, but we thought it'd be cool to go over some of the unintended benefits. I was going to say unintended consequences. That sounds kind of scary. Unintended benefits of kung fu training, right? Because we always find that, and you know this, when you come in, you kind of hear the same when people start kung fu, when they're curious about starting on the journey. They're relatively the same kind of concepts. I want to get in shape. I want to learn better focus, better discipline, better confidence, and everyone comes in for those to a degree. Those reasons they vary a little bit, but more or less that's it. And then obviously in self-defense, right? And then an interest in kung fu philosophy and things like that. But as you get into it, you start to notice that there's a whole lot of benefit that you didn't really see coming at all. So really big bonuses, which end up being really I would think kind of the reason that you stay. The reasons that you start might not be the same reasons that you're gonna stick with it. I don't know if you'd agree with that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So I thought it would be fun to do that because it's hard to get that perspective. It's hard to convey that perspective. If we could properly and efficiently convey that perspective, you'd have people lining up the door right away to break your door down and say, I want to get whatever it is you got, but it's hard to convey that. Hard to put it into words. So anyway, we'll give it a shot. So what are some things that you've found since the beginning of training that you didn't really start with, you didn't intend on, but here they are? What's one of them?
Yeah, well, for me, it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. I find that I rarely slip and fall anymore. I may slip, but I find that I've gained a sense of balance and a sense of equilibrium, and horse stance definitely comes in handy with managing your balance. You slip on ice. One thing is that I find by reflex that knee comes right up under my torso, and I get myself into a horse stance essentially as fast as I can, or even into some sort of 3-point or 4-point stance. Get my hands on the ground to catch my weight, and that's one thing that I've definitely found. Definitely improved balance.
Yeah, you know what else I kind of going along with that too. I've found that it's also because in Mantis, right? In Prey Mantis, we train drunken Mantis, right? So the drunken style is in there, and part of that is learning to relax. And the phrase that we always teach with that is that when the drunk and the baby falls from the carriage, they don't get hurt, right? Because they're relaxed. Whereas when you tense up, that's when you're more likely to get injured, cause that trauma or whatever. So I find I agree with you there. Yeah, just the reflexes are better, balance is better, but also the not panic. You know what I mean? Like that. Oh, I'm falling. Okay, my body knows what to do, and the lack of panic also kind of helps, right? Because usually when you fall and hear yourself, it's the panic of wrenching your arm a certain way or landing on a certain way. So even if you do fall, that relaxation helps.
I think also you dropped a gem there when you said your body knows what to do. That's the result of practice, right? And really, when we look at the term kung fu itself, it's essentially the result of practice. That which is the result of practice, if you look at it in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Practice being dedication, sacrifice, work, etc. Your body learns what to do, and oftentimes that calm comes from the fact that you only realize what happened after you reacted to it, right?
Yeah, and that's not something that's and that's something that lasts a lifetime. I remember one time, this is going back maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Grandmaster Chow was telling me we were training, and I think he said for that day he had to take it a little bit easy. He didn't say he was hurt. So he did take it a little bit easy because he fell on the ice, right? And he's in his mid 80s, right? So I got really worried. Sifu, are you okay? Like you fell on your 85 and you fall on the ice. That's like could be a pretty big deal, right? And he's like, oh yeah, it's fine. I just relaxed and I tucked my chin,
Yeah.
because he was saying when he lived in Japan, he was in
Yeah.
school in Japan and he did judo too, right? So
Judo.
they were always big on the break falls and tucking his chin. But really, he said it was just, it was the relaxing and not panicking. But again, yeah, trust the body. The body knew what to do after all those years of training. So yeah, I think that's a really good one.
Mhm.
And I tell people that too.
Well,
You sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to lead into the next, but carry on with your example.
It's just a fun one. I've noticed that early on in training, like just being like at the kitchen or something, and then working with things and something drops, and then the first time you twitch and you catch it really quick, and you're like, oh wow, you think it's magical. Like I'm ready for the dragon scroll. Yeah, it's good reflexes. It's just that training does that.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up for number 2, right? Is that sometimes I'll knock, say, a glass off the table, and then I'll realize it and catch it with the same hand that knocked it over, without necessarily spilling it either, right?
Yeah.
So reflexes and hand-eye coordination, and they tend to make life easier, right?
Mm-hmm. So one of the ones I had that we talked before this that I think that we're gonna kind of overlap a little bit in this one is you mentioned how to learn, and for me, yeah, I was thinking along the same thing, but for me, a big part of Kung Fu was learning how to self-manage in order to start learning, but retrain behavioral patterns, retrain habits, right? And, teaching myself to kind of discipline for the long game, because we tend to have that in our culture, especially whenever we get excited about taking on a new task or setting a new goal, starting a new endeavor, getting all the, like for example, when you see a movie that inspires you, right? And then you want to do whatever you saw. So you go out and you buy all that gear, and then that excitement will like maybe stick around for a couple of weeks, and then it'll fade. And then you have all this gear that you spent money on, and then, the flare is over. Then you got to go and you got to go find something else to spend money on. Right. And this is why like the fitness industry is like $1 billion industry. People aren't getting in shape. Right? I mean, it's like some are, but a lot of aren't. And the industry is still thriving because of that. We all, people have that excitement to get started in something without that conditioning of follow through. So that's one thing that I learned from Kung Fu. And I tell my students this, I always say this: when you start, give yourself the 1 minute rule, right? You're going to be excited. You're going to get new shoes. You're going to get new pants and a new jacket. And you're going to be like, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to train for an hour a day. I think we've talked about this before, right? And I say, no, hold on, hold the phone. Don't train for an hour a day. Train for 1 minute a day, and that's it.
That's
like,
it.
What? How are you going to master anything at 1 minute a day? Well, you're not going to master anything by doing it like full on for 2 weeks and then forgetting about it. You're never going to master anything that way. But if you do 1 minute for 2 weeks and then double it to 2 minutes for another 2 weeks and double it to 4 minutes and keep on compounding, you're going to have a habit in place, which is just going to, pull you along that journey because you're reconditioning behavior. And once you get that, you learn that with Kung Fu, you do that with anything. When I tell people that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say an interesting analogy that I'd heard one time is basically the question: would you want to eat all of the food you're ever going to eat in your life in one day?
That's a good analogy.
No, you wouldn't, right? So take your time with your training. You're good with 3 meals a day. Be good with whatever training you can put in per day.
Yeah.
You got to put in some, but it'll amount to what it amounts to, right? It'll amount to what it amounts to. And if you want it to amount to more than the result that you're getting, then dedicate a bit more time to it, right? But be happy with I say be happy. I wasn't happy with the result that I would have gotten if I had trained any less. So I trained as much as I did, right? But I understood how important it was to me. And so I didn't regret having to dedicate the time that I had to dedicate to it, right? We spend our time on what we spend our time on what we want, on what interests us. Mm-hmm. We can find the time to do whatever it is that we want to do because we do what we want to do with the time that we have. Believe me, you do. Nobody jumps in your skin and lives your day for you, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So simple.
Yeah, I think another part of that too, and I was just talking about this last night or the night before, we were doing our progress checks, right? So we're going to test everyone in 3 or 4 more weeks. We kind of progress check them to see where they're at. And I was telling everyone, like, look, how are you with your, on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you on your progress? Are you happy with your progress? Don't tell me. I told them, count numbers on your fingers out of 5. How many fingers for how well you think you did, and then like hide it to yourself. No one else needs to see it. You need to see it. Are you satisfied with what you did? That's the first step. And the second step is, don't take it personally, right? If you're not happy with your progress, realize your progress is just a result of what you put in. Don't take it personally if you don't like it, right? If you take it personally, you beat yourself up. You're further ahead, right? Now, sometimes you want to push yourself, but think about it this way: if you're not happy with the output, like you said, increase the input, right? But when when you beat ourselves up, we take it too personally. It's like training a student. When a student is not doing well, right? We don't criticize the student. We criticize the behavior, right? You say, you're a great student. However, this behavior right now is unbecoming of you. This is not what we'd expect, not what we'd hope for. That's it. We wouldn't want to attack the student personally, right? It's not personal. We would just want to talk about, this is the behavior. We want to see this behavior right here. We're over here. Now we want to be over here. And why would we do anything different with ourselves, right?
Right. I mean, especially considering that they walk through the door, right? That in and of itself shows you clearly what they want. If they didn't want, results in this area of life, they wouldn't have come. So you've come. I'm here to help you. And it's not necessarily about criticizing the student, as you say. It's about identifying what we need to identify and putting the work where we need to put the work, right?
Yeah. So another one that I had, and this one may be a little more philosophical, but it's along the same. It's kind of on the same vein. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I've learned is to balance compassion and wisdom, right? And this goes back to this. I tell this story often. I don't know if we ever talked about this before, right? There's the story in Kung Fu, which I consider this the essence of Kung Fu. Did I ever tell you about the story about the moth, the man who takes the moth home? Right?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, this is great. So I'm hoping that someone new watches this, because my students have probably heard me say this tons of times. So the man's walking in the woods and he finds a cocoon of a moth, an emperor moth. So it's a big one, right? And he looks at it and he's very cool. And he knows what's going to happen next. The thing's going to start, climbing its way out. So he takes it home to observe, right? And he, nothing happens the first couple days. Then after watching it for a couple days, he sees the thing start to move around a little bit and it's starting to, come out, starting to do its job and come out its cocoon. Well, there's such a struggle, and he's watching this thing struggle and struggle and struggle to get out of this cocoon, and he feels bad. So he gets some scissors and he cuts the hole bigger at the end to help out, right? Well, of course, the moth then flops out and it's all chubby and it's got like little wings that are useless, and it just flaps around and it dies, right? I tell it's like, oh, this is a horrible story. Well, but the point is that there's 2 layers. It doesn't have a happy ending, but it teaches us something, right? It teaches us that when you take away people's struggles, right? So if you guys, not familiar with this, what happens is nature has its way of putting the moth through this struggle. And then that struggle forces the fluid in the moth's body out into its wings. So its wings become, huge and capable of flight. Without that struggle, all that fluid in the body isn't able to push out and expand into the wings. Hence, chubby moth, little wings, and it just died. It didn't become what it was meant to be through that struggle, right? So on the one level, we have to recognize that, this struggle that I'm going through right now, what is this shaping me into? And in a world where, we have unchecked compassion, like compassion is important for us at our school. It's one of our Black Sash values, but we have to make sure that it's kept in check with wisdom, because this man in the story was definitely very compassionate, but he was compassionate without wisdom, right? So that balance, I find, is something that, and we as instructors, we can help with that, right? Not with a lot, not across the board, but often there's you know, kind of it's more seen now that a lot of parents have a hard time recognizing that struggle with their kids. They want to take the struggle away from them all the time. It's just, you know, it's just there. They're nervous about, you know, causing conflict or whatever. So no, well, that's too difficult. I don't want to put you through that. I don't want you to have the struggles that I had, right? But the struggles that you had in some cases are the struggles that made you a competent person that you are, right? So taking away those struggles is not always the best thing. So I find balancing that, learning to balance compassion and wisdom, I think, is one of the best things I've learned from Kung Fu. So that's the story about it anyway.
Yeah, it's a balance, definitely a balance.
How also, when you said, so we kind of started with, you know, I went in with how to learn, but more importantly, like, not more importantly, but differently, how to make habits, how to set patterns. So how would you describe that learning to learn for yourself?
Yeah, learning to learn. How would I describe that? So for me, well, I'll use Kung Fu as the example since that's the topic that we're talking about anyhow. But with the forms practice that we had to do, there was a volume of some would say particularly complex movements in some cases. We had to learn sequence, and beyond learning the sequence, there was also a tempo, a cadence to it, as well as I would say almost a flavor to the actions as well. Flavor being otherwise context. I think context would be another word I could use for flavor. I could maybe use for flavor. And it required, I feel it required me to systemize the process. First step, obviously, being memorization, because without memorization, what are you really examining, right? We were fortunate to have those printouts of the Grandmaster Wong's books. You remember we had those printouts that Grandmaster Chow gave us, but we did not necessarily have those for each and every routine, right? And otherwise, you know, we had to write it down. But even the writing it down was meant to be a tool towards ultimately, I think, internalizing the actions, right? And how do you go from seeing your teacher, maybe receiving some instruction, to eventually internalizing these actions, right? So committing them to memory, I would say, would have been what became the first step for me. You have to figure out how to memorize what you can. And through memory, I remember reading a book by a guy named Ouspensky, and he wrote about various centers within oneself. So you'd have your intelligence center, you'd have your movement center, you'd have your emotional center, being the ones that generally apply in most cases. The intelligence center would do the work of memorizing, right? And how it would work is that, or how he would explain it, how it makes sense, is that your intelligence, your mind, your conscious mind is involved with the act of actively trying to memorize something, like a song. You know, like songs when you're a kid or whatnot. You'll hear a piece of the song that resonates with you, maybe the hook or whatnot, and you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until you memorize it. And then, so for me, it was finding some movement within the form that, well, this is now kind of getting onto how I start to internalize things, but with learning the routine itself, there's a sequence that dictates how you have to memorize. There's a sequence of the movements. There's a beginning, middle, and end, and we learn them in chunks. We learn them generally in lessons, and so you begin memorizing the actions of one lesson. You practice them at home repeatedly until you begin to memorize those movements. Next week you go to class, or next class you show up, you learn, you know, a couple more moves, and you string them together towards a result. Okay, so we complete the step that's memorization with practice and repetition. Then we move on to so moving from your intelligence center then to your movement center taking over. So you no longer consciously think about the movements after a point of repeating them to the point you internalize them. Then your body takes over. It becomes muscle memory as right. And at that point, it's best that the intelligence, it's best that the mind, the conscious mind, stays out of the way. I'm sure there have been times in practice where, oftentimes for me, it was when we were doing repetitions of a particular movement, and there's one particular rep, and the teacher might say, that was a really good kick. That one, number 7 out of your 10 was a really good one, right? Try to remember what that feels like and repeat that action that way. And that was a way of finding proper technique in order to induce muscle memory through repetition consciousness. Anyhow, you get to that point where your body then has internalized the movements themselves, or begins to internalize the movements themselves. And for me, then beyond that, it's now, okay, what am I actually doing? This is where the context comes in. It's like, what am I actually doing? Well, in this case here, it's muscle. So generally what we're trying to do is manage balance and transfer force, right? From myself, or through my feet, rather, into an object, right? So how am I now performing these movements which I've memorized? And do I feel that that will transfer the proper force into said target or object? Right? And if it doesn't, then how may I correct the action, right? Am I doing the action properly in the first place? If I am, then is it the timing of the action? Is it the, what is it, right? And can I figure that out? And then you just repeat that process over and over and over. And there's a lot of repetition involved in what I'm saying. And then it generally becomes an expression. And a lot of that expression you can pick up from just watching your teacher. I mean, Master Chow, and I think a couple of our colleagues in particular, you can kind of see when somebody kind of gets the idea. But it's a very interesting thing, that process. So to me, that was that way of learning how to learn. And when I kind of realized that I had that a process to, is when I found myself kind of applying that same manner of operating to different areas of life, kind of like with learning languages or whatnot. So that was one thing that I think that I picked up from martial arts that I didn't expect, was to find a way of kind of organizing myself to learn things.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you talk to almost anyone who's mastered an art or whatever, like a technique or like a skill set of some kind, they'll be basically saying the same thing, right? Once you've mastered something, one thing, right? You've got that capacity to learn anything else because you've got that context and
right.
That format already. Well, and I wanted to, if you're watching and you have a notebook, write that down. Write down manage. What did you say? Manage balance and transfer force. That was well put. That's pretty much it. Because when it comes to our self-defense, and our self-defense is mostly on our feet, it's pretty simple. We like to overcomplicate it with all kinds of, punches and hooks and all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, it's managing our balance and transferring force. That's a good point. What one other one that I had, and this we wanted to talk a little bit about, what it was like for us, training back when we started. So the other thing that I found, the unintended benefit, was the circle of influence. And your peer group, and understanding that if you manage that, and like everything else, even in self-defense, positioning is so important. If you position yourself right, your defense can be much easier, your attacks can be much easier, much more effective if you're positioning yourself right. If you're positioning yourself wrong, you're more likely to lose balance. You have to use more force than you otherwise would, right? Do more work, exactly. With the right position, everything is so simple. And your circle of influence is like that, because we're social animals, and we're always susceptible to influence of the people that were around, right? And when you are surrounding yourself with with a group that influences you to push yourself a little bit harder, and stay focused on the training, stay focused on a lifestyle that supports the training, because there is a lifestyle that doesn't go along with kung fu training, right? One that's not, if you're not particularly looking at what you're eating, what you're drinking, what you're reading, what your eyes are digesting all the time, and what's might skew your point of view on what's possible or what's not possible. That's going to have an effect on your training. So now, mental diet as well. And if you're in the right group, they're going to reinforce the behaviors that you want, right? That's not to say that you can't be proficient at kung fu if you're in the wrong circle. It just makes it a lot harder. And why make it more difficult on yourself, right? So if you're with family and they're always talking about, like, I don't know if you've heard this yet, when you're running a school, one thing your family often says is, "Oh, how's that thing going? Did you get a real job yet?" Like, well, I've been teaching professionally for 17 years. I don't really,
Right?
I don't really like what I'm doing. I'm not sure. You mean like a job that I don't like, that I'm miserable at all the time?
Exactly.
How do you define real, right? If it's based on boredom and misery and
Does that work? Exactly.
repetition, then I don't really want a part of it. But anyway, sorry. But if you have family that's very critical of what you're doing and on your path of self-cultivation, you might just want to not mention it when you're around them, and don't bother discussing it, right? It'll just make it easier for you. And when you're in the right room with people that are going to support you, that's when you want to bring it up, and it'll make your training easier. Not that it's impossible without that, but it definitely makes it a lot easier. And I found that when I was training with Grandmaster Chow, we were lucky. We kind of had mostly guys around our age that we would hang out with afterwards, and we would just like after training we would go out and we would just be talking about the same thing again, right, about kung fu, how it's applied, and we'd talk more about the community and what style's doing what and that kind of thing. That was really fun. But that it pushed the training up, I think, to a much higher level, because the quality of conversation was much different. I know it forced me to think really hard about what I was doing, the training I was doing, how I was doing it, how I was applying technique, make sure that I would take the movement seriously and not just kind of go through them, right, but use intensity on every movement when I was training. And that circle helped me do that. And plus we had guys like Sifu, Adam Ferreira, like they and and his training partner Mark, they just wouldn't take any crap at all, right? Just call out my crap right away. Like, what was that? That was garbage, right? But we had a good enough rapport that they could do that. I don't recommend doing that to your training partners if you're not totally comfortable working with them. Yeah. Did we get all three?
I think we did. I think we did.
Well, I got go ahead.
Oh, go for it.
I just had a story. I had a story about Grandmaster Chow. I was gonna share about when balancing compassion and wisdom, going back to that point, because there was times when I was hoping for compassion, and instead I got wisdom. And that happened a lot, right? So we were training. We went to New York to compete at that NTD TV competition thing they had in New York, right? And Grandmaster Chow, he said, yeah, go, because one of the reps came around to the club and she wanted a few of us to go, and he said, yeah, okay, you go. And so I told him I could bring some people from our club in Niagara Falls. So I took Jean Lewis at the time, and I took Miss Gibbons. They went with me, and they were coming up and practicing with us in Scarborough, right? And Miss Gibbons was doing praying mantis steps out of cave, which is a long form. It's like how you count it, 65, 70 movements. Like it's so long, right? And what he did was he said, okay, like, you know, when I did this when I was younger, I would cut off this many moves at the end, so it'd be shorter, so that way when you bow out of it, you're not like totally gassed and you can still look, you know, focused. So you be a little short. And that's what he told her, right? And then I asked him, Sifu, what form you think I should do? And he said, oh, do four directional fighting, you know, very good form, lots of kicks, jumping and everything, right? So I was like, okay, I'll do four directional fighting. So I'm training this form, and it's like, when you're training this form a lot, it's really it's a lot of work.
Yeah,
right?
It's very athletic,
a lot of jumping and spinning kicks and everything, and I'm getting tired. So like when I'm practicing over here and I hear him, you know, talking to Gibbons, like, oh yeah, we can shorten, make it a little easier. I'm like, so I go over and I go, hey, Sifu, what about, you know, what about making this form a little shorter so I can make the shorter part look much bigger rather than doing the whole thing, you know, and being tired for the whole thing. Like, let's apply that same logic over to this guy over here. Right? And he goes, you want something easier to do? Huh? No, Sifu. Okay, go.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I'm just picturing Master Chow right now saying that. Yeah.
Very like
giving you that sideways look, like he starts looking at you sideways.
So
oh, you want something easier to do? No, Sifu, I'm good.
So yeah, no, that was it. That's all I had to say. So I did it. I did the whole form. It practiced a lot. It was exhausting. Turned out really good.
Nice.
Glad I did it. But that was that same thing, that balancing wisdom and compassion. Had he been more compassionate, it would have been nice at the time. Long term, it wouldn't have helped out, because I trained a lot on that form, and for a while then after that was like my go-to form for a demonstration, right? Because I had drilled it so much. So you know, not to say it again, like, you don't want to be hardcore John Kreese on your students all the time, but we need to balance it, right? Balance it, and wisdom gives it that understanding. Is like, okay, there's a struggle here. What is that struggle going to do? Can that struggle be endured, right? Is it a struggle that's going to, you know, help us with growth? Is it a struggle that's going to result in trauma? Like, you know, we need wisdom to discern which it's going to be, and then act accordingly, but not just default to take the struggle away right away because the person, you know, is having a hard time with it, right? We've got to dissect that a little bit. So
you need that pressure that turns coal into diamonds, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was my anecdote for the week.
Yeah, you know what, actually, that's another thing I can mention is I think another benefit that I got is that understanding that there is an amount of pressure that's required, right? And I think about now more so when it comes to like the physical conditioning aspect, the mental game of that aspect of training, right? And it's like, you know, internally what you can do, right? The teacher at the front of the class, you know, of course we're monitoring our students. We don't want, you know, we're not necessarily training until you want to puke in the corner or anything like that. We're paying attention. But I mean, short of that, it's an internal monitor. So what I try to tell students is challenge yourselves. If we're working on a stance or something like that, and you know that you can go lower, right? That pressure's got to come from self, right? There is an appropriate amount of pressure. You don't necessarily have to be the lowest person in the room, but you know when you're challenging yourself, and that's where the growth is, right? You might be a little tired, right? Maybe you had a long day or whatnot. Sure, fair, but you walked in the door, right? So find that point where you know consciously that you're doing your best, and you're challenging that zone, you know, and that's where the growth is at, and little by little it'll come.
I think you just touched on actually the of all the stuff that we've talked about, that's probably, we didn't talk about it before, you just came up with it now, but that's probably, I think, the greatest benefit right there is that knowing how to apply pressure on yourself,
Mhm.
you know, because that's what's going to give you growth, not shying away from that pressure, but knowing how much to apply to get the result that you want.
That
Yeah,
you want.
that's a very good point, because now that you have that in Kung Fu, you can go and do that with any new task. Like if you want to take something up, okay, well then I'm going to have to do this, you know, do this difficult thing that other people, you know, wouldn't do to get the result that most people won't get, right?
Yep.
Good
I
point.
mean, you've spoken about eat bitter, taste sweet,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
You want to learn something new. You want to change a habit. You want any result that you want. It's going to take some kind of sacrifice. There's some sort of equivalent exchange when it comes to that. You may be closer to it. You may be further from it. But that's just the size of the task. You break any task down into manageable bits, and you take these smaller goals, as we'll call them, and 2 or 3 smaller goals may give you an equivalent result to a larger attempt, right? Rather than trying to swallow the task whole, right? Break it up into smaller chunks, right?
mhm.
And you get more wins along the way, and each W bolsters your confidence, right? So instead of setting yourself one big task that, really in your heart, it's quite daunting, and you know that you might fail before you start, break the task down into manageable portions that you can win. And as long as they're trending in the direction of the result that you want, no matter how small those steps are, as long as you're taking step after step, the only way you lose if you quit.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and you've got momentum. When you got momentum, you're less likely to quit too, right? Good
Exactly.
point. Okay. Well, that was awesome. I hope anyone watching got some value out of that, at least a laugh. So
Indeed.
thanks for joining me. And yeah, we'll do this again, what, 2 weeks from now? Third week of the month, 17th, I think, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for joining me, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.